Hi, folks. I want to take quick seconds to talk to you about the Juneteenth of the American War for Independence, or the June 30th, as it turns out. When historians talk about the American War for Independence, they will put the hinge point, the turning point, at the battles of Saratoga. Those are in the fall and September and October of 1777, and due in large measure to Benedict Arnold. No Benedict Arnold, no American independence. Period. But because of the victory over Burgoyne at the battles of Saratoga, generally it's considered by historians that the French take the opportunity to acknowledge openly their diplomatic alliance with the United States, and then pledge to actually commit to an army and a navy for the campaigns in North America. And then when the French come into it, then the war changes. So when most people talk about the War for Independence, they'll talk about essentially April 1775 up to the fall of 1777. So Lexington and Concord to Saratoga, and then from Saratoga to Yorktown. So for the next 3.5 years, 4 years until Cornwallis surrenders, and then that's the entire war, right? So you have the campaigns in New England and the North, which basically are over by March 1776 when the British evacuate, but also when the Americans, also under Benedict Arnold with Richard Montgomery and others, capture Montreal and are defeated at Quebec. But all of that's over by March 1776. There is a pause after the British evacuate Boston. They go to Nova Scotia. They regroup. They try to figure out what they're going to do next, and then they return in 1776 to basically wipe George Washington all over most of the Mid Atlantic colonies. They capture New York. They capture Philadelphia, and they basically chase George Washington around a lot. Until Saratoga. Of course, Washington doesn't have anything to do with Saratoga. The Burgoyne is defeated at Saratoga, the French come in, and then it really just becomes a world war. It becomes a conflict between the French and the British, and the French end up winning that war, and the Patriots come along for the ride. But for narrative purposes, what most people think of is that, well, it's Lexington and Concord, shot heard around the world, right? To Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown, and then that's the end. Except none of that's true. None of that's true if we, in fact, just sort of think about actually the War for Independence as the people who lived through it experienced it. So, for example, then what we have to do is that we have to de-emphasize and deprioritize events that have become iconic but actually have had little lasting impact at the time. So we don't talk about the Boston Massacre, right? The Boston Massacre is a little bit of nifty Patriot propaganda that is mainly the product of Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, but it has no lasting impact outside of Boston. It doesn't have any even immediate impact outside of Boston. Nobody else really talks about it or thinks about it. It doesn't actually impact the American Revolution or the War for Independence. It is a flash in the pan. So if you take that, but it is exploded by later historians who want to create this coherent narrative that blends, as both Benjamin Rush, the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams talked about, is that too many people were too quick after the Revolution was forgotten, to conflate the American Revolution with the War for Independence, when the American Revolution is separate from the War for Independence. Anyway, that's a bit of the project that we're working on right now with the Patriot Myth. But to me, that when you look at the War for Independence in a broader sense, if you expand the scope, geographically, and you include Canada and the Caribbean, so all of British North America and the Caribbean, and you also expand it in different ways temporarily. So you expand it to past Cornwallis. That doesn't end the war, right? There are other armies in the field. There's still combat. After that, until really the British finally evacuate what is the United States in 1783. So then the shooting war, there's the part of New England that lasts, and the North that lasts from 1775 to the early part of 1776. But the bulk of the war that people really know is the War for Independence, which is pretty much after independence is declared in 1776 to November of 1783. When the mass British evacuations are complete, along with the single greatest act of abolition in early American history, which is the British which is British freedom for enslaved people who had belonged to Patriots, or not, which is what I want to talk about here and get your thoughts on. When we think about the war for independence, we think about an exchange of power among white people, right? This is nothing changes for anybody else. This is really about an exchange of power among elites. One form of government for another, just slightly different version of the same government. Okay, we're going to elect our king. We're not gonna have that king be. We're not going to have that king be hereditary. However, we're going to get our elected king much more power than that hereditary king ever came even close to having. So we're just going to shuffle the deck chairs in government. We're going to innovate, but we're not actually going to not create anything new. However, if we think about wars for independence and what actually changes when something gets transformed into a proper war for independence, it's on June 30th, 1779. And that's when Henry Clinton, who was the British commander-in-chief of all the British armies in North America, issues the Philipsburg Proclamation. So it's not exactly a Juneteenth, it's a June 30th, but it has the same kind of impact by transforming a war for independence into an actual war for the independence of people who have in fact been deprived of it, and that's enslaved people. So the language is, as the enemy have adopted practice of enrolling Negroes, all such taken in arms shall be purchased for the public service at a stated price, the money to be paid to the captors. That's not a lovely part of it, but if there are enslaved people who have taken up arms with the Patriots, not many did, but they would be purchased. When they're taken, they would be purchased from whoever captures them, and used for public service. So, like, they would be put into the army, or used for their engineers, or what they call them, the pioneers. But the more important part of it, because it didn't apply to that many. There are not that many enslaved people who actually enrolled with the Patriots, because the Patriots didn't want them to. Was this part: no one to claim a right over any Negro who may take refuge here. And Negro deserters promised liberty to follow any occupation. That's it. I mean, it's the first part of that that's particularly important. No one to claim a right over a Negro who may take refuge here. That is an extension of the legal theory that is set forth in the Somerset case of 1772, when we want to actually give other points of history their legitimate role. Here is a moment in which Justice Mansfield articulates the legal status of enslaved people in England. And that is going back to, he examined it all the way back to medieval England in order to find some sort of cognate for why something such as the right of habeas corpus cannot apply to an enslaved person, which is part of the claim in the underlying cause of action. And part of that includes the fact that, it's based upon the fact that this person, James Somerset, is property. Well, Mansfield can't find a cognated English law of claiming a person as property. Persons are always persons. They're just on a range of servitude. Now, this might be lifetime servitude, and he can't really find that, but it's all about servitude. There is no cognate. There's no precedent for claiming a person as property. And that is part of the holding. And that is a major issue then, coming out of that. But it is a major issue that actually influences the Philipsburg Proclamation. This is the theory. No one can claim a right over another person behind British lines. That is what unlocks the freedom to tens of thousands of enslaved people. And that is something that actually transforms the war for those people, and transform the war for the Patriots who are worried about that. Is this June 30th moment in 1779. That turns the war into an actual war for their independence. The British win, you get to the British, you get your independence. And you get it immediately, without qualification, without service, without question. That is something really to think about when we think about the war for independence, wars for independence in that context, and who it's really for, how it gets transformed, and who in fact is supplying it. It's worth a thought. The other Juneteenth.